The old bus wheezed to a stop at the small-town station, black smoke puffing from its exhaust like tired breath. David stepped down onto the cracked pavement, his worn army bag slung over one shoulder. The afternoon sun hit his face, and he automatically turned his left side away from the curious stares of the few people waiting nearby. The scar was impossible to hide. It ran from his temple down to his jawline, a thick, angry line that told a story he wished he could forget. Smaller marks dotted his neck and hands, each one a memory from that terrible day in the desert when everything changed. Cedar Ridge wasn't much to look at. Population 11 to 500, according to the faded welcome sign. Main Street stretched out before him with its mix of old brick buildings and newer strip malls. A few pickup trucks were parked outside the local diner, and an elderly man sat on a bench reading a newspaper. It was exactly what David had hoped, for quiet, affordable, and far from anyone who knew his story. He'd chosen this place because the rent was cheap and nobody asked too many questions. At least that's what he'd hoped. His disability checks from the military went further here than they would in any big city. All he wanted was a place to disappear, to heal, and maybe find some peace. The hardware store stood on the corner of Main and First, its red brick facade weathered but solid. Above it, a small apartment waited for him. The landlord, an older man named Pete, had been surprisingly understanding over the phone. When they met in person, David noticed the way Pete's eyes took in his scars without flinching. Later, he learned that Pete had served in Vietnam and understood things that others couldn't. "Apartment's nothing fancy," Pete had said, handing over the keys. "But it's quiet, and the rent includes utilities. Pay me the first 3 months up, front, and we'll call it even." David had been grateful for the simplicity of the arrangement. No background checks, no references, no long applications. Just a handshake between two veterans who understood that sometimes a man just needs a fresh start. The first few days in Cedar Ridge were lonely but peaceful. David established a routine that kept him mostly invisible. He'd wake up before dawn and go for long runs through the empty streets, his footsteps echoing off the sleeping houses. The early morning air was clean and cool, nothing like the dusty heat he remembered from overseas. These runs helped clear his head and tire his body enough that sleep might come easier at night. Grocery shopping became a careful dance of timing. He learned which hours the stores were quietest, when he could slip in and out without drawing too much attention. Even so, he couldn't avoid all human contact. The checkout clerks were polite but distant, their eyes flickering to his scars before quickly looking away. Children stared openly until their parents pulled them along with whispered apologies. At the local diner, things were different. The waitress, a kind woman with gray hair and gentle eyes, served him coffee without making him feel like a curiosity. Her name tag read Dorothy, and she had the sort of no-nonsense manner that comes from years of dealing with all kinds of people. "You settling in okay, honey?" she asked during his third visit, refilling his cup without being asked. "Yes, ma'am. Thank you." "Good. This town takes some getting used to, but most folks here are decent once they know you." David nodded, wondering if that would ever really be true for someone who looked like him. He'd seen the way conversations stopped when he entered a room, the way parents instinctively stepped between him and their children. He couldn't blame them, really. His face told a story of violence, even if they didn't know the details. The evenings were the hardest. With nothing but four walls and his own thoughts for company, the memories would come flooding back. The sound of the explosion, the screams of his friends. The moment he realized that Jake and Tommy hadn't made it out, he'd saved 12 soldiers that day, pulling them from the wreckage of their convoy while enemy fire rained down around them. But all he could remember were the 2 he couldn't save. The nightmares came almost every night in those first weeks. He'd wake up sweating, reaching for weapons that weren't there, calling out names of friends who would never answer. The doctors at the VA hospital had given him pills, but they made him feel disconnected from everything, like he was watching his life through thick glass. Shopping at the local grocery store was always an adventure in discomfort. People would see him coming and suddenly remember something they needed in a different aisle. Teenagers would whisper and point, thinking they were being subtle. Once, he overheard a conversation between two mothers in the cereal aisle. "Did you see that man's face? What do you think happened to him? Car accident, maybe? Or one of those industrial accidents. Either way, it's terrible. Makes you count your blessings." They weren't being cruel, just curious. But their words stung anyway. He wanted to tell them that his scars came from saving lives, not destroying them. That every mark on his face represented a choice to put others before himself. But explaining would mean reliving it all, and he wasn't ready for that. The local barbershop was another challenge. David's hair had grown long and unruly during his travels, but the thought of sitting still while someone worked around his scars made him nervous. When he finally worked up the courage to go in, the old barber took one look at him and simply said, "Take a seat, son. Let's get you cleaned up." The man worked in comfortable silence, his experienced hands gentle around the scarred areas. When he was finished, David looked almost human again. The barber refused to take payment. "First cut's free for any veteran," he said simply. "I can tell by the way you carry yourself. Thank you for your service." It was the first time anyone in Cedar Ridge had acknowledged what he'd been through, and David had to fight back tears as he left the shop. Slowly, David began to understand the rhythm of small-town life. There was a comfort in the predictability of it all. The same faces at the same places, the same routines day after day. It wasn't exciting, but it was safe. Nobody expected anything from him here except to pay his rent on time and keep to himself. But safety came with a price. The isolation was crushing sometimes. Back in the military, he'd been surrounded by brothers who understood what they were all going through together. Here, he was completely alone with his memories and his pain. The silence in his apartment was deafening, broken only by the occasional car passing on the street below. He tried to fill the empty hours with books, mostly military history and biographies of other soldiers who'd made it through their own dark times. Reading about their struggles helped him feel less alone, even if he was the only one in his apartment. Sometimes he'd find himself talking to the pages, arguing with authors or agreeing with their conclusions out loud just to hear a human voice, even if it was his own. The people of Cedar Ridge weren't cruel, exactly. They were just afraid of what they didn't understand. His scars made them uncomfortable because they reminded everyone how quickly life could change, how fragile safety really was. It was easier to avoid him than to confront those uncomfortable truths. By the end of his first month in town, David had settled into a routine that kept him mostly separate from the community around him. He was like a ghost haunting the edges of their normal lives, present, but not really part of anything. It wasn't the life he'd imagined when he was younger, but it was peaceful, and peace was all he really wanted anymore. Little did David know that his quiet life was about to be turned upside down. Sometimes the very qualities that make someone an outsider are exactly what's needed when crisis strikes. His scars told a story of survival and sacrifice, and soon the people of Cedar Ridge would learn to read that story properly. For now, though, he was just the scarred stranger who lived above the hardware store, keeping to himself and bothering no one. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight, in his small apartment with the sounds of the sleeping town drifting through his window, David allowed himself to hope that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a place where he could finally heal. October in Cedar Ridge brought crisp mornings and the smell of burning leaves. David had been living in the small town for 6 weeks now, and his routine had become as predictable as the changing seasons. Morning runs, quiet grocery trips, evenings, spent reading in his apartment above the hardware store. It wasn't much of a life, but it was peaceful. That peace shattered on a Tuesday evening when 17-year-old Lisa disappeared. David first heard about it on his old radio while making dinner. The local news announcer's voice was tight with concern as he described how Lisa had vanished somewhere between the public library and her home on Maple Street, just 4 blocks in what everyone considered the safest part of town. Lisa was the kind of girl every small town treasures. Honor roll student, volunteer at the animal shelter, the teenager who helped elderly neighbors carry their groceries. Her parents ran the town's only Chinese restaurant, and Lisa often worked there after school, charming customers with her bright smile and perfect manners. The family had moved to Cedar Ridge 5 years ago, and Lisa had grown up to become one of those kids everyone knew and loved. By Wednesday morning, the whole town was in chaos. David could see it from his apartment window. Cars racing back and forth, people gathering in worried clusters on street corners, the sheriff's department vehicles patrolling constantly. The normal quiet rhythm of Cedar Ridge had been replaced by something urgent and frightening. He walked down to Pete's hardware store to see what was happening. Pete was standing behind his counter, listening to a battery-powered radio with several other men from town. "Any news?" David asked quietly. Pete shook his head grimly. "Nothing good. Sheriff Bradley's got every available person out looking. They're organizing search parties at the town square every few hours." David nodded and bought a few supplies he didn't really need, just to have something to do with his hands. As he left the store, he could hear the men talking behind him, their voices full of fear and anger. "In my day, this kind of thing didn't happen here. Got to be someone from outside town. Nobody local would hurt that girl. Maybe we should set up checkpoints, watch who's coming and going." The search efforts were impressive to watch. Within hours, volunteers had organized into groups covering different areas around Cedar Ridge. They combed through the woods at the edge of town, checked abandoned buildings, and knocked on doors asking if anyone had seen anything unusual. Lisa's parents stood in the town square, her mother clutching a recent photo while her father spoke to anyone who would listen, begging for information about his daughter. David felt drawn to help, but he hesitated. He knew how the townspeople saw him, the scarred stranger who kept to himself. Would they even want his assistance? Still, something about the situation reminded him of his military days, when finding missing people could mean the difference between life and death. On Wednesday evening, he made a decision that surprised even himself. He walked to the town square where another search group was forming. The reaction was exactly what he'd expected and feared. Conversations stopped mid-sentence as people noticed him approaching. Parents instinctively moved their children closer. The crowd that had been buzzing with activity suddenly fell into an uncomfortable silence. Sheriff Bradley was a stern man in his 50s, with iron gray hair and suspicious eyes. He looked David up and down, taking in every scar, every mark that told the story of that terrible day overseas. "Don't believe we've met," Bradley said, his hand resting casually near his service weapon. "You're the fellow living above Pete's place, right?" "Yes, sir. David Miller." David caught himself using Lisa's last name by mistake, a slip that made several people exchange worried glances. "I'd like to help search for the missing girl." Bradley's eyes narrowed. "That's real generous of you. But I think we have enough volunteers for tonight. Maybe you should head on home." The rejection stung, but David had expected it. He turned to leave, catching fragments of whispered conversations that followed him like shadows. "Did you see how nervous he looked? Been here, 2 months? And now this happens? Something's not right about that guy. Those scars. What if he's dangerous?" The suspicion in their voices was clear. To them, his damaged face told a story of violence and danger. They didn't know that his scars came from saving lives, not taking them. They couldn't see past the surface to understand that every mark represented a moment when he'd chosen to help others instead of protecting himself. But as David walked away from the crowd, his trained eye caught something the others had missed. Near the library's side entrance, partially hidden by an overgrown bush, was a small piece of torn fabric. Bright yellow material, the same color as the jacket Lisa had been wearing according to the missing person flyers posted around town. David's heart started pounding. His military training kicked in automatically, and he found himself scanning the area like he was back in a combat zone. The fabric was caught on a low branch, about chest height. There were scuff marks in the dirt nearby, and when he looked closer, he could see signs of a struggle that the other searchers had walked right past. Someone had grabbed Lisa here, right outside the library where she worked part-time. But whoever had taken her was smart enough to clean up most of the evidence. Only someone with training would have noticed the small clues left behind. David carefully photographed the scene with his old flip phone, making sure not to disturb anything. His mind was already working through the possibilities. If Lisa had been taken from this spot, where would her attacker have gone? The main roads would be too risky, too visible, but Cedar Ridge was surrounded by old logging roads and abandoned properties that most people had forgotten about. He wanted to run straight to Sheriff Bradley with his discovery, but he knew how that would go. The sheriff was already suspicious of him. Showing up with evidence would only make things worse. They'd probably think he'd planted it there himself. Instead, David decided to do what he did best, work alone and stay quiet. He spent the rest of the evening walking through town, memorizing every street, every alley, every possible escape route. His military intelligence training had taught him to think like both hunter and prey, to understand how someone planning something terrible would move through unfamiliar territory. Thursday morning brought more bad news. The official search parties had found nothing. Lisa's trail had gone completely cold after the library, and Sheriff Bradley was starting to talk about calling in state authorities. The mood in town was getting darker, more desperate. David overheard conversations at the diner that made his blood run cold. People were starting to look for someone to blame, and as the only real outsider in Cedar Ridge, he was becoming the obvious target. "I'm just saying it's quite a coincidence," one man was telling his breakfast companion. "Girl disappears right after this stranger shows up in town. Did you see his face? Those aren't accident scars, that's combat damage. Who knows what he's capable of? Maybe we should be asking Sheriff Bradley why he hasn't questioned him yet." David ate his eggs and toast in silence, pretending not to hear. But inside, he was making plans. If the town was going to blame him anyway, he might as well use that time to find Lisa himself. His scars had already marked him as guilty in their eyes, so he had nothing left to lose by investigating on his own. That afternoon, while the official search parties focused on the woods and farmland around town, David began his own systematic search of Cedar Ridge's forgotten places. He'd studied maps at the library, talked to Pete about the area's history, and identified dozens of locations where someone could hide a person without being discovered. The old grain elevator on the edge of town, the abandoned gas station on Highway 12, the network of storm drains that ran under the downtown area. Each location told him something about how well someone knew the local geography and how long they'd been planning this. As Thursday evening approached, David realized something that chilled him to the bone. This wasn't a crime of opportunity. Someone had been watching Lisa, studying her routine, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. And if they were that organized, that patient, it meant Lisa might not be the first person they'd taken. Standing in his apartment as darkness fell over Cedar Ridge, David made a decision that would change everything. The town might not want his help, but Lisa needed it. And after failing to save his friends overseas, he wasn't going to fail another innocent person if he could help it. Tomorrow, he would begin the hunt in earnest, not as part of any official search team, but as a soldier on a mission to bring someone home safely. His scars had made him an outcast, but they'd also made him a survivor. Now it was time to put those hard-earned skills to use. Friday morning came with a heavy fog that seemed to match the dark mood hanging over Cedar Ridge. David stood at his apartment window, watching the search teams gather once again in the town square. Lisa had been missing for 3 days now, and hope was starting to fade from people's faces. David knew he couldn't approach Sheriff Bradley with his discovery of the yellow fabric. The suspicion in the sheriff's eyes had been clear enough during their first meeting. If David showed up claiming to have found evidence that trained searchers had missed, it would only make him look more guilty in their eyes. Instead, he decided to do what he knew best: work alone and stay invisible. His first stop was the town library, where Lisa had been working when she disappeared. The librarian, Mrs. Patterson, was a nervous woman in her 60s who kept glancing toward the door as if expecting trouble to walk in at any moment. "Terrible business," she whispered, when David asked about Lisa's last day at work. "Such a sweet girl. Always stayed late to help reorganize the children's section." "What time did she usually leave?" David asked casually, pretending to browse through a book about local history. "Around 6:30 most evenings. She'd lock up the side entrance and walk home down Maple Street. Same route every day for the, past 2 years." That detail stuck with David. Same route, same time, every day. Someone had been watching Lisa, studying her patterns. This wasn't random. It was planned. He spent the next hour in the library's reference section, looking up old newspaper archives and property records. What he found made his stomach turn. Over the past 3 years, 4 other young women had disappeared from small towns within 50 miles of Cedar Ridge. All teenagers, all last seen walking home from work or school, all vanished without a trace. The pattern was clear to anyone who knew how to look for it. But when David tried to share this information with Deputy Mitchell, the younger officer just shook his head. "Look, friend, I appreciate your concern, but we've got real police work to do here. Sheriff Bradley already told you to stay out of this. But if you just look at these dates and locations—" "I think you should head on home now," Mitchell interrupted, his hand moving to his radio. "Don't make me call the sheriff." David left the police station feeling frustrated but not surprised. He'd seen this kind of thinking before in the military. When people were scared and under pressure, they often rejected information that didn't fit their preconceived ideas. The town wanted to believe this was an isolated incident, something that could be solved quickly and forgotten. They didn't want to hear that they might be dealing with someone who had been hunting in their area for years. That afternoon, David began his own systematic search of Cedar Ridge's forgotten corners. He started with the abandoned buildings on the outskirts of town, old farmhouses, closed-down businesses, structures that had been empty so long that most people forgot they existed. His military training served him well. He moved quietly, observing everything, looking for signs that someone had been using these places recently. Fresh tire tracks in old gravel, disturbed dust patterns, small items that didn't belong in abandoned spaces. At the old Johnson farm, 3 miles outside town, he found something interesting. The main house had been empty for years, but someone had recently cleared a path through the overgrown driveway. David followed the trail carefully, his senses alert for any sign of danger. Behind the farmhouse stood an old storm cellar, its wooden doors weathered but still solid. Fresh scratches around the lock suggested someone had been there recently. David took photos with his phone and marked the location on a hand-drawn map he'd been creating. As evening approached, David realized he was racing against time in more ways than one. Not only was Lisa still missing, but the town's suspicion of him was growing stronger every day. He'd heard the whispers at the diner, seen the way people crossed the street when they saw him coming. If he was going to find Lisa, he had to do it before Sheriff Bradley decided to arrest him just to satisfy the angry townspeople. That night, David spread his map across his small kitchen table and studied every mark he'd made. Using skills learned during intelligence briefings overseas, he began to see a pattern that the official searchers were missing. The abandoned locations weren't random. They formed a rough circle around Cedar Ridge, connected by old logging roads that most people had forgotten existed. Someone who knew this area well had been using these forgotten places as a network, moving between them, staying one step ahead of any casual discovery. It was the kind of knowledge that came from years of living in the region, or from spending a lot of time studying it. David's phone rang, startling him out of his thoughts. It was Pete from downstairs. "You might want to know," Pete said quietly. "There's been some talk around town. Some folks are getting worked up, saying maybe the police should take a harder look at certain newcomers." David felt his stomach drop. "How worked up?" "Worked up enough that I'm thinking you might want to keep a low profile for a while. Maybe stay in tonight." After hanging up, David looked out his window and saw small groups of people gathered on street corners, their faces serious and angry in the glow of the streetlights. Fear was turning into something uglier, and he was the obvious target. But Lisa was still out there somewhere, and every hour that passed meant her chances of survival were getting smaller. David had to make a choice: protect himself by staying hidden, or risk everything by continuing his search. The decision wasn't really a choice at all. He'd failed to save his friends overseas, and that guilt had been eating at him for months. He wouldn't fail Lisa, too, no matter what it cost him. David pulled on his dark jacket and slipped out the back entrance of the hardware store. If the town was going to blame him anyway, he might as well earn their suspicion by doing something. That actually mattered. His first destination was the old grain elevator he'd noticed on his earlier scouting trips. It stood like a concrete tower against the night sky, dark and silent. But as David approached, he noticed something that made his pulse quicken. Fresh tire tracks in the gravel parking area. Tracks that hadn't been there during his afternoon visit. David felt all his military instincts kick into high gear. Someone was using this place, and recently. He circled the building carefully, noting every detail. A side door that should have been rusted shut showed signs of recent use. Windows that should have been covered with dust had been wiped clean from the inside. This was it. This was where someone had been hiding. But as David prepared to investigate further, he heard the sound of an engine in the distance getting closer. Car headlights swept across the access road, heading straight for the grain elevator. David dropped to a crouch behind an old piece of farm equipment, his heart pounding. Someone was coming back to this place, and they were coming now. In just a few minutes, he might finally come face to face with the person who had taken Lisa. The question was whether he was ready for what he might find. His scars had been earned in combat, but this was different. This time, he was completely alone, with no backup and no one who even knew where he was. If something went wrong, the town would probably assume he'd just run away to avoid suspicion. But as the headlights got closer, David thought about Lisa's parents standing in the town square, holding her photo and begging for information. He thought about the fear in Mrs. Patterson's eyes at the library. He thought about all the other families in other towns who had lost their daughters to whoever was behind this. His scars were proof that he'd faced worse odds before. Tonight, he'd find out if the man who survived that explosion overseas still had what it took to save someone else's life. The engine sound grew louder, and David prepared himself for whatever was about to happen. Ready or not, the hunt was about to become very real. David crouched behind the rusted farm equipment, his breath forming small clouds in the cold night air. The headlights were getting closer, sweeping across the gravel road that led to the old grain elevator. His heart pounded so hard he was sure whoever was coming would be able to hear it. The vehicle pulled up to the building and stopped. A truck door slammed shut, followed by heavy footsteps on gravel. David risked a quick look around the edge of his hiding spot and saw a large man walking toward the side entrance of the grain elevator. The man moved with confidence, like someone who had been here many times before. David waited until the footsteps disappeared inside the building before moving closer. Every step felt like it might be his last. His military training kicked in automatically. Stay low, move quietly, always have an escape route planned. But this wasn't a war zone with fellow soldiers backing him up. This was just him, alone in the darkness, trying to save someone he'd never even met. The grain elevator loomed above him like a concrete giant. Up close, he could see that someone had definitely been using this place. The rust around the door handles had been worn away by frequent use. Fresh oil stains marked the gravel where vehicles had been parked. This wasn't just a hiding spot. It was someone's regular base of operations. David found a broken window on the side of the building and carefully peered inside. The interior was dark, except for a thin line of light coming from somewhere deeper in the structure. He could hear movement, the sound of someone walking around inside, but couldn't make out any voices. Taking a deep breath, David squeezed through the window opening. The old building smelled of dust and motor oil, with an underlying odor that made his stomach turn. Something was very wrong here. He moved through the shadows, following the sound of footsteps and the thin trail of light. The grain elevator was bigger inside than it looked from outside, with multiple levels connected by old metal stairs. David climbed carefully, testing each step before putting his full weight on it. On the second level, he found what he was looking for and what he was dreading. A makeshift room had been set up in one corner with a camping chair, some old blankets, and a collection of items that clearly didn't belong to whoever was supposed to own this building. But it was what he heard next that made his blood freeze. A weak voice, barely more than a whisper, coming from somewhere below. "Please, I want to go home." Lisa. She was alive. David's hands shook as he realized what he'd stumbled into. This wasn't just someone hiding out in an abandoned building. This was a carefully planned operation, and Lisa was being held somewhere in the lower levels of this structure. He had two choices. He could try to get Lisa out quietly and run for help, or he could wait and confront whoever was holding her. Here. But Lisa sounded weak, maybe hurt. Moving her quickly might not be possible, and running would just give her captor time to disappear with her again. David made the hardest decision of his life. He would stay and fight. Moving even more carefully now, he made his way down to the ground level where the voice had come from. In a corner that had been walled off with old plywood, he found a door, with a heavy lock. The weak voice was coming from behind it. "Lisa," he whispered as quietly as he could. "Who's there?" The voice was scared but hopeful. "My name is David. I'm here to help you. Are you hurt?" I think I'm okay. Just tired and scared." "Are you police?" David almost laughed, thinking about how Sheriff Bradley had treated him. "No, I'm not police, but I'm going to get you out of here." "He'll be back soon," Lisa whispered urgently. "He always comes back at night. You have to go get help." "I'm not leaving you here," David said firmly. "We're both getting out of this together." But even as he said it, David heard the sound of footsteps returning, heavy boots on the metal stairs moving with purpose. Whoever had taken Lisa was coming back, and David was trapped in the lower level with no easy way out. David looked around desperately for anything he could use to defend himself and Lisa. The grain elevator was full of old equipment and tools, but nothing that would be much use against someone who might be armed. The footsteps stopped at the top of the stairs, and David heard a voice that chilled him to the bone. Well, looks like someone's been poking around where they don't belong." The man who came down those stairs was bigger than David and younger, with the kind of confidence that comes from always getting his way. He wore work clothes and had the calloused hands of someone who did physical labor for a living. But it was his eyes that told David everything he needed to know. Cold, calculating, and completely without mercy. "You must be the guy everyone in town's been talking about," the man said casually, as if they were meeting at a coffee shop instead of in the lair where he'd been holding a teenager prisoner. "The one with all the scars. Folks think you're the one who took the girl." "Let her go," David said, stepping protectively in front of the makeshift prison where Lisa was being held. "This is between you and me now." The man laughed, a sound that echoed off the concrete walls. You think you're some kind of hero? Look at yourself. You're a broken-down soldier that nobody wants around. Even if you somehow got out of here alive, who do you think they'd believe, the respected local businessman or the scary stranger with the messed-up face? David realized with growing horror that this man wasn't just some random predator. He was someone from the community, someone people knew and trusted. That's how he'd been able to operate for so long without being caught. You've done this before, David said, remembering the pattern of disappearances he'd discovered. Other towns, other girls. Smart man, the predator said, circling David like a shark. Too bad being smart won't help you much now. The fight that followed was brutal and desperate. David's opponent was bigger and stronger, but David had something more powerful: years of military training and the absolute determination to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves. They crashed into old equipment and concrete walls, each trying to gain the advantage. David's scars burned as he took hits, but he kept fighting, thinking about Lisa trapped behind that door, thinking about all the other families who had lost their daughters to this monster. The turning point came when David managed to get his hands on a piece of heavy chain that had been left by some long-ago workers. It wasn't much of a weapon, but it was enough to even the odds. When it was over, the predator lay unconscious on the concrete floor, his hands and feet tied with rope David had found in the storage area. David's face was bleeding from new cuts that would probably leave new scars. But he was alive, and more. Importantly, so was Lisa. It's over, David told her as he broke the lock on her prison with a crowbar. You're safe now. Lisa was weak and scared, but she was alive and coherent. As David helped her out of the makeshift cell, she looked at his scarred face and said something that would stay with him forever. You came for me. When nobody else could find me, you came. David called 911 on his old phone and waited with Lisa until help arrived. When Sheriff Bradley and the rescue teams finally reached the grain elevator, they found Lisa safe, her captor in custody, and evidence of crimes that stretched across multiple states. As the ambulance took Lisa to the hospital and the FBI took charge of the crime scene, David quietly stepped back into the shadows. He had no interest in being called a hero or having his picture in the paper. He'd done what needed to be done, and that was enough. But word of what really happened that night spread through Cedar Ridge faster than wildfire. The scarred stranger everyone had feared and avoided had risked his life to save one of their own. The man they'd suspected of being a monster had turned, out to be the one who stopped the real monster. Everything was about to change for David, but as he sat in the back of an ambulance getting his new cuts treated, all he could think about was that Lisa was going home to her family. After all the people he hadn't been able to save, he'd finally saved someone who mattered. The scars on his face told a story of survival and sacrifice, and now the people of Cedar Ridge would finally learn to read that story correctly. The news spread through Cedar Ridge like a summer wildfire. By sunrise, everyone in town knew the truth about what had happened at the old grain elevator. The scarred stranger they'd all feared and avoided had risked his life to save Lisa Chen. The man they'd whispered about and suspected had turned out to be the hero their community desperately needed. David sat in his small apartment above the hardware store, watching the chaos unfold through his window. Police cars filled the streets, news vans from neighboring cities had started arriving, and groups of townspeople gathered on every corner, talking in excited voices about the night's events. His phone had been ringing all morning, but he ignored it. Reporters wanted interviews, officials wanted statements, and people he'd never met wanted to thank him. But David just wanted quiet. The adrenaline from the confrontation had worn off, leaving him exhausted and overwhelmed by all the attention. A soft knock on his door interrupted his thoughts. He opened it to find Pete standing in the hallway, holding a cup of coffee and wearing an expression David had never seen before, something between pride and apology. "Thought you might need this," Pete said, offering the coffee. "And I wanted..." To say something before the whole town comes knocking on your door. David accepted the coffee gratefully. What's that? I'm sorry, Pete said simply. We all are. We looked at your scars and made up stories about who you were instead of taking the time to actually know you. You don't need to apologize, David replied. You were the only one who gave me a chance when I first got here. Maybe, but I should have done more. Should have spoken up when people started talking nonsense about you being dangerous. Pete shook his head. That girl's alive because you had the courage to do what the rest of us couldn't. After Pete left, David tried to return to his normal routine, but normal no longer existed. When he went for his morning run, people waved from their porches and called out words of thanks. Children who had once stared at his scars in fear now looked at him with something approaching awe. At the diner, Dorothy refused to let him pay for his breakfast. Heroes don't pay for coffee in my restaurant, she said firmly, refilling his cup with hands that no longer shook when she looked at his face. I'm not a hero, David protested. I just did what anyone would have done. No, honey, Dorothy said with a knowing smile. Most people talk about doing the right thing. You actually went out and did it, even when everyone was against you. The transformation was remarkable to witness. The same people who had crossed the street to avoid David now sought him out to shake his hand and hear his story. Parents who had pulled their children away from him now encouraged those same kids to wave hello during his daily walks. But perhaps the most meaningful change came from Lisa's family. 2 days after the rescue, David received a visit from Lisa's parents. Her father, a quiet man who rarely spoke to customers beyond taking their orders, stood in David's doorway with tears in his eyes. You brought our daughter home, he said in halting English. How do we thank someone for giving us back our world? Lisa's mother pressed a small wrapped package into David's hands. Inside was a jade pendant carved in the shape of a guardian lion. In our culture, she explained, this represents protection and courage. It belongs with someone who has shown both. But the moment that truly changed everything came when Lisa herself visited David a week later. She was still pale and thin from her ordeal, but her spirit seemed unbroken. She looked directly at David's scars without flinching, something very few people had ever done. They're not ugly, she said quietly. They're proof that you're a survivor. Proof that you fought and won. Those words hit David harder than any explosion ever had. For months, he'd seen his scars as marks of failure, reminders of the friends he couldn't save and the life he'd lost. But Lisa saw them differently, as evidence of strength, not weakness. The recognition that followed was overwhelming. The FBI commended David for his actions, which had led to solving not just Lisa's case, but multiple missing person cases across 3 states. The local newspaper ran a front-page story about Cedar Ridge's unlikely hero, though David still refused. Most interview requests. Job offers poured in from police departments and security companies, all wanting to hire the man who had tracked down a predator that professional investigators had failed to find. But David had different plans. He enrolled in the criminal justice program at the regional community college, deciding to formalize the skills he'd learned through necessity and trauma. If he was going to help people, he wanted to do it the right way, with proper training and official authority. The first day of classes was nerve-wracking. David worried that his scars would make him stand out among the younger students, that people would stare and whisper like they had when he first arrived in Cedar Ridge. But his reputation had preceded him. Instead of fear or curiosity, he was met with respect and admiration. His professors, learning about his background and recent heroics, often used his experiences as teaching examples. Mr. Miller here, one instructor said during a class on criminal investigation, demonstrated something that can't be taught from textbooks, the importance of looking where others aren't looking. As winter melted into spring, David's life in Cedar Ridge took on a richness he'd never expected. He was invited to neighborhood barbecues, asked to coach Little League baseball, and included in community events as naturally as if he'd lived there his whole life. Children who had once feared his scars now competed to sit next to him during school visits, where he talked about safety and making good choices. Their innocent questions about his injuries gave him opportunities to discuss the real costs of war and the importance of protecting others. The nightmares that had plagued him for months began to fade. Not completely. He still had difficult nights when the memories came flooding back. But now he had something to balance against those dark thoughts. He had proof that his survival meant something, that the skills forged in combat could be used to protect rather than destroy. One evening, as David walked through the town square where search parties had once gathered in desperation, he reflected on how much had changed. The same people who had once whispered about him now nodded respectfully as he passed. The place, that had felt like exile, now felt like home. A year later, Detective David Miller of the Cedar Ridge Police Department stood before a graduating class of criminal justice students, his scars visible but no longer hidden. He'd become a legend in his own lifetime, not through conquest or fame, but through the simple act of refusing to let others' judgment define his worth. Lisa, now a social work student specializing in trauma recovery, often credited David with teaching her that survival was just the beginning of the story. He showed me, she would tell people, that our worst experiences can become our greatest strengths if we choose to use them to help others. The man they had once laughed at had indeed walked into legend. But more importantly, he had walked into a life of purpose and belonging. His scars, once sources of shame, had become symbols of hope for others facing their own struggles. Standing in that classroom, looking at faces that showed respect rather than fear, David finally understood what Dorothy the waitress had tried to tell him months earlier. Heroes aren't born perfect. They're forged in the fires of adversity, and proven by their choice to keep fighting for others, no matter what the cost. Cedar Ridge had taught him that home isn't a place where people accept you despite your scars. It's a place where they understand that those scars are part of what makes you valuable. And sometimes, the very things that make us different are exactly what the world needs most.